On the night of November 25th, 1938, in Halifax, England, Clifford Edwards crouched over a woman who was lying in the street. Blood poured from a deep gash on her arm, and Clifford was terrified, not at the injury, but at the angry mob he heard marching down the street towards him. Clifford looked up, and through the thick fog and the shadow cast by the streetlights, it looked like 20 or 30 people must be coming for him. Clifford stood up and started to run, but there was no escape. The town of Halifax had gone mad, and they believed Clifford was the man who had been terrorizing them for over a week, a man who had come to be known as the Halifax Slasher. The Halifax Slasher is one of those stories that on the surface seems really terrifying. Story of a man stalking his prey at night, emerging from the fog almost unseen, slashing with a razor, slamming with a hammer, leaving bodies littering the streets. But when you start to unravel the story behind the Halifax Slasher, it becomes something far stranger and honestly, something even scarier. On November 16, 1938, so 9 days before Clifford Edwards would get attacked on the streets, two women, Mary Gledhill and Gertrude Watts, were walking home in Halifax. A thick fog hung over the night, partially because of the natural climate of northern England, where Halifax is located, and partially because of the smoke pouring out of the local textile factory. But despite all that, neither woman was frightened. After all, this was a walk they made almost every day, and Halifax was relatively safe and a tight-knit community. So the women walked and talked, going over what they had done for the day and what they had planned for the week, when suddenly they heard a strange jangling noise, almost like someone was wearing bells on their shoes. The women looked through the fog, but they couldn't see anything. They heard footsteps, and before they could do anything, Mary felt a hammer slam down on her arm. She screamed. Gertrude tried to run, but then she got hit. The women stood there, dazed. Then they crumpled to the ground. They heard footsteps and that jangling sound, but when they looked through the fog, their attacker had disappeared. After the women received medical attention for their wounds, they reported the incident to the police. And the police instantly went on high alert, because 5 years earlier, they had witnessed a string of similar attacks in the city of Halifax. Now, the person behind those attacks had been apprehended and put in jail, but now police worried that maybe a copycat was out, someone trying to relive the attacks of 5 years ago. So they put officers out on the streets, monitoring corners, watching the factory, making sure everything was safe. And for a couple of days, nothing happened. But then, on the night of November 21st, so 5 days after this first attack, a woman was walking home at night through the dark and fog when suddenly she felt a slash across her arm. Blood poured out of the wound, but just like the first attack, whoever had done it quickly disappeared into the fog. Now, there was something different about this attack than the one that had already been reported. Whereas Mary and Gertrude said they had been hit with a hammer or mallet, this woman clearly said she had been slashed with a razor. And even though police tried to keep some details hidden from the public, this got out. And soon, the newspapers jumped on the story. And all of a sudden, everyone was afraid of the Halifax Slasher. And very quickly, the attacks continued and escalated. Night after night, men and women would report similar things. They were walking home, they heard a strange noise, and then they were attacked, sometimes with a razor, sometimes with a hammer, sometimes with what felt like claws. And so this story of the Halifax Slasher just gained momentum. It made headlines not only in Halifax, but all across the country. So the town of Halifax came to believe they were being hunted. And police tried to keep this under control while desperately looking for the attacker. But they knew they could not handle this. And so they did what most smaller police forces in England did at the time when they needed help. They reached out to Scotland Yard. By 1938, Scotland Yard, or the Metropolitan Police, were already at the forefront of forensic investigation. While we were still decades away from things like DNA testing, the Yard had committed itself to scientific and investigatory-based police work. Gone were the days when they wanted detectives solely to work on a hunch. They wanted concrete evidence. They wanted to approach this as a scientific investigation. And so when the Yard arrived in Halifax, they started interviewing all of the victims, possible witnesses, and most importantly, they started looking at evidence. And after just a couple of days, inspectors from Scotland Yard all came to the same conclusion. None of this made any sense. Not only were the wounds on each victim completely different, they often didn't match the story the victim had told. And so some people who said they had been obviously slashed with a razor looked almost as if they had been scratched by someone's fingernails. People who said they'd been attacked with a mallet or a hammer didn't have near the level of bruising that would take place if that kind of weapon was used. And so these inspectors were baffled. They thought either there's a string of multiple attackers working together or essentially functioning as copycats, or something very different is going on. Now, the people of Halifax did not want to hear this. They were convinced that their hometown had become unsafe, that they would never be able to walk alone at night again. And so vigilante groups started forming. These groups would walk the street with makeshift weapons, patrolling all the areas of the town, looking for anyone who might be the Halifax Slasher. By the time November 29th came around, and Clifford Edwards found himself out on the street, the Slasher had already claimed 13 victims. So Clifford, like everyone else, was on edge, and as he was walking home, he heard a woman's screams pierce the silence. He ran through the fog, and that's when he found Hilda Lodge lying on the ground, bleeding from her arm. And so he crouched down, trying to help Hilda, right when the angry mob arrived. And Clifford tried to explain himself, but no one wanted to listen. And before he could run, he felt himself dragged to the ground and getting pummeled. And finally, police whistles blared out. Cops arrived and were able to at least drag Clifford from the crowd. They took him right to jail, believing they had possibly found the Halifax Slasher. And while Clifford waited in jail, the mob gathered outside, shouting that they wanted him convicted, some shouting that they wanted him put to death. But when Clifford explained his story to the local police and to Scotland Yard, it all checked out. He really was a man just trying to help a neighbor who he thought had been hurt. But things had gotten so crazy, the panic had spread so far that police had to sneak Clifford out of the station and get him home without anyone seeing because they feared for his life. Chaos had started to reign in Halifax. Vigilante groups roamed the streets, and if someone looked wrong to them, they would attack. They saw the Halifax Slasher on every street corner, walking out of every door and lurking in every shadow. And finally, on November 29th, so 4 days after Clifford got attacked by the mob, police received a confession. But this was not the confession they had expected or had been looking for. One of the Halifax Slasher's victims, a man named Percy Waddington, arrived at the police station and admitted the wounds he'd received from the Halifax Slasher were actually self-inflicted. Percy's confession made it to the newspapers, and soon the story spread. And in the following days, more and more victims of the Halifax Slasher came forward and admitted they too had inflicted the wounds upon themselves. And soon, Halifax police released a public statement which said, "There has never been, nor will there likely be, a bogeyman like the Slasher stalking the streets of Halifax." So in short, the Halifax Slasher, this man who had terrorized an entire city for a week and a half, inflicting violence on multiple victims, never actually existed. So, what happened? How did a group of rational adults, a large group across an entire city, come to believe that this man was on the loose? And even more so, how and why did some of these people take part in the lie? The simple answer, which really isn't that simple at all, is mass hysteria or psychogenic illness. Psychogenic illness, according to psychologists and psychiatrists, occurs when an idea or fear or a belief can spread essentially like a virus. And so when one report came in and then another, and then the media picked it up, this fear, a legitimate fear, spread through the city. So while some of the slasher's victims may have been self-inflicting wounds to get attention, to feed the frenzy, because they loved chaos, some of them may have truly believed they'd been attacked. They may have convinced themselves that even though they were the ones scratching their arms, a madman had actually leapt out of the fog and attacked them. There are a number of reasons why people believe this could have happened. One of the most important is the situation that people in Halifax found themselves in 1938. They were still struggling to break free of the Great Depression, and perhaps more importantly, they were approaching the end of what's known as the interwar period, the years between the Great War and World War II. And Halifax, like all of the United Kingdom, was still reeling from the effects of the Great War. And the country was left in economic turmoil. And while it was trying to build itself back up, war was looming with Germany again. And so there was already this stress and tension and dire economic situation in place. And things like this can make an area, especially a close-knit community like this section of Halifax, a perfect breeding ground for something like mass hysteria to take hold. And so, while a terrifying story about a razor-wielding psycho stepping out of the fog might make a better horror movie, the true story behind the Halifax Slasher, in my opinion, is far more disturbing and, honestly, much more tragic. All right, that was Case File 006, the Halifax Slasher. We have new case files every Friday, so make sure to subscribe to Adjunct Horror. All right, bye, y'all.